Welcome to EKO201E Economics. I'm Chris Hannum, and this will be Lecture 5 on elasticity. In Lecture 4, we introduced the basic model of supply and demand, that fundamental workhorse model in economics. And we presented these ideas of the law of demand and the law of supply. The closest thing you'll get to something like a natural law in economics. The law of demand tells us interesting, relevant things about the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity that people will demand, the quantity that people will buy. And it tells us that we should expect that as the price rises, people, all else equal, will demand less. They will buy less. As I say, quantity demanded will fall. But what it doesn't tell us by itself is anything about how much the quantity demanded will fall. And that's a critical piece of information that we need to know, we need to understand in any context, in any given market, for any product, point in time, in order to be able to utilize that model of supply and demand, in order to make predictions which are relevant for business, which are relevant for policy, etc. So we need some way to measure how responsive that quantity demanded is to something like the price. And that measure, which we'll talk about today, that we prefer is what we call elasticity. Now, the basic idea of elasticity is simply that elasticity is a measure, one of many potential measures, but it's a measure of how much the quantity demanded or quantity supplied responds to a change in some other variable, to some variable that's one of those determinants of demand or determinants of supply, chiefly price. Mostly when we just say elasticity, we're talking about a specific elasticity called the own price elasticity of demand. So that's the responsiveness of quantity demanded to the price of the good itself. Now, there are other elasticities, which we'll get into later, which describe the responsiveness of different things, such as quantity supplied, or quantity demanded to different determinants. As a simple formula, which you can see in the slide, to describe our own price elasticity of demand, is a simple fraction. It's the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in the price. So if we have a percentage change in quantity demanded of 20, and we have a percentage change in the price of 10, then our own price elasticity would be 20 divided by 10, or 2. Note, of course, based on that law of demand, we should expect that a percentage change in the price, if it's positive, will always go along with a percentage change in the quantity, which is negative. So own price elasticities are always negative based on that law of demand. Now, if they're always negative, it doesn't really matter to us that we mention the fact that it's a negative 2. So we just describe it, generally speaking, as 2. Now, there are other elasticities other than the own price elasticity of demand, for which we can have negative or positive values. And when we can have either negative or positive values, it becomes important whether it's positive or negative. But for the case specifically of the own price elasticity of the demand, it's always negative, so it doesn't matter at all. We simply ignore that fact. Loosely speaking, we would say that this measure, this percentage change in price divided by percentage change in quantity, simply measures how responsive people are, buyers are, demanders are, to changes in the price. If we have a high value, say 5, 10, 20, for our own price elasticity of demand, this would mean that buyers are highly responsive to change in the price. Changing the price changes their behavior a lot. On the other hand, if we had a very small number, say 0.1, for our own price elasticity of demand, this would indicate that buyers are not very responsive to changes in the price. They don't respond very much when the price increases. Next, as we look at a movement, as you can see in this next slide, from point 1 on our demand curve to point 2 on our demand curve, this combination of Q1P1 to Q2P2, moving along the demand curve, we can see a percentage change in the price on the vertical axis, as P2 has a higher price than P1, and a percentage change in quantity on the horizontal axis as quantity decreases from Q1 to Q2. See, this movement from point 1 to point 2 along the demand curve goes along with a 10% increase in the price and a 15% decrease in quantity demanded for an elasticity of 1.5, indicating that quantity changes by 1.5 times as much as price does. Now, of course, when we're using a simple demand curve, starting with point 1 and point 2, we wouldn't know immediately that moving from point 1 to point 2 gave us a 10% or a 15% change. We'd use those level values, say the specific prices at point 1 and point 2, and the specific quantities at point 1 and point 2. As you can see in the slide now, the example of moving from point A to point B gives us a decrease in quantity from 12 to 8 and an increase in price from 200 to 250. So now we need to calculate what the percentage change is, given those points, so that we can use the percentage change to calculate the elasticity. We could take one simple formula for calculating the percentage change, being the end value, B, minus the start value, A, divided by the starting value. So as we move from point A to point B in price, we would go from 200 to 250. So our change would be 250 minus 200, and our percentage change would be 250 minus 200 divided by the starting value of 200, giving us a percentage change in the price of 25%. Now, unfortunately, if we use this method for calculating the percentage change in the price, it does matter which we determine to be our starting value and which we determine to be our ending value. Now, if we choose the starting point to be point A, then we would calculate the percentage change as 250 minus 200 divided by 200. On the other hand, if we chose B to be our starting value and A to be our starting value and moved downward along the demand curve instead of upward along the demand curve, then our percentage change in price would be 200 minus 250 divided by 250. And that would give us a percentage change of only 20% and not 25%. Now, the same would also be true for our calculations of percentage changes in quantity. And the end result is that if we move from A to B, we would calculate an elasticity of 1.33. But if we move from B to A, which should be exactly the same change, but reversed, we would calculate an elasticity of 2.5. Now, this is not desirable, clearly. Moving from one point to another, or moving back from the other point to the first point, should give us the same measure of the responsiveness of demand. So we need to find a different way, slightly modified way to calculate these percentage changes, which will allow our calculation of elasticity to be consistent in this way. So the way that we've found to get around this problem is by using what we call the midpoint method. Using the midpoint method to calculate our percentage changes, instead of taking the end value minus the starting value divided by the starting value, or the end value minus the starting value divided by the end value, both of which would give us inconsistent results depending on which we chose to be the end and which we chose to be the start, we take the end value minus the starting value divided by the midpoint between those two. So if our end value is 250 and our starting value is 200, then our midpoint between those two is 225. So we would calculate our percentage change in price as 250 minus 200 divided by 225. And then as we move in the other direction and we switch which point is the start and which point is the end, we would calculate that percentage change as 200 minus 250, again, divided by 225. And in both cases, we would have the same percentage change as we move from A to B or B to A. And as a result, we'll wind up with the same value for elasticity as we move from point A to point B or point B to point A. In the simple example you see in the slides, when we calculate that percentage change moving from point A to point B or point B to point A along the price, 250 minus 200 divided by 225 is always 22.2%, no matter which direction our change takes place in. And that percentage change in quantity, which is 12 minus 8, or 8 minus 12, divided by the midpoint between 8 and 12, is always 40%, no matter which direction we make the change go in. As a result, the price elasticity of demand would now always be 1.8, whether we move from A to B or B to A. Now, contrast that with our original estimate based on a division by the starting value in calculating percentage change, where we could have 1.33 or 2.5 as our two estimates for elasticity, depending on whether we moved from point A to point B or point B to point A. Our new estimate for elasticity of 1.8 is in between those two levels. Next, what we want to discuss, in the same vein as what we discussed in the previous lecture when talking about supply and demand and their determinants, are what determine the elasticities of supply and demand. For now, we're focusing specifically on this own price elasticity of demand. Own price elasticity of demand can be high, a high degree of responsiveness, or low, a low degree of responsiveness by consumers to changes in the price. Look at two pairs of goods for simple explanatory cases, two pairs of goods where the price of each good we assume rises by 20%. And try to think which of these two goods you think would have a larger change in quantity demanded. That is to say, which of these goods would see quantity demanded fall by a larger percentage? Our first example, look at the two goods, breakfast cereal, such as muesli on one hand, versus sunscreen on the other hand. Obviously, these two goods don't have very much in common, but they don't need to. Which would you imagine has a larger responsiveness to changes in the price? Well, here, the key thing to bear in mind is that for the case of breakfast cereal, there are many other goods that you could consume instead as alternative breakfasts. It's not the case that if you don't buy breakfast cereal, you won't be able to eat breakfast at all. There are many other things that you could eat instead. We described this, using terminology from the previous lecture, that breakfast cereal has many close substitutes. That is, many related goods that you could consume instead. On the other hand, sunscreen does not have close substitutes. You may personally not buy very much sunscreen. You may personally not use sunscreen at all. But for those people who do buy sunscreen, on the occasions when they need sunscreen, there aren't really any other options available to them. If they're heading to the beach, if they don't buy any sunscreen, they'll either need to spend all day under an umbrella or wind up bright red and itching and in pain. Now, if sunscreen has few close substitutes, so few alternatives to buying sunscreen, and breakfast cereal has many close substitutes, therefore a lot of alternatives to buying breakfast cereal, we would expect consumers to be willing to pay a much higher price for sunscreen without necessarily changing the amount that they buy very much. But the same would not be true for breakfast cereal. If you increase the price of breakfast cereal by 20%, consumers would be likely to switch to buying some other breakfast food. So this is the first determinant of the elasticity of demand, the number of close substitutes, the fact that they exist and how close they are. Sunscreen, because it does not have many close substitutes, would be expected to have a low elasticity of demand. Breakfast cereal, because it has many close substitutes, would be expected to have a high price elasticity of demand. Our next pair of goods would be, on the one hand, blue jeans, and on the other hand, clothing. Which of these two goods would you expect to have a higher price elasticity of demand? Which would you expect to have a lower price elasticity of demand? Well, this is directly related to the conclusion that we draw from the comparison of breakfast cereal versus sunscreen. Blue jeans and clothing are goods which are defined very differently. Blue jeans are very narrowly defined, simply one type of clothing out of many. Now, there are many other types of pants, many other types of clothing you could wear. You don't have to wear blue jeans, particularly if blue jeans become very expensive. Clothing, on the other hand, is a good that's very broadly defined. So whereas we could choose to buy, say, dress pants instead of blue jeans, we can't choose to buy any other type of clothing instead of clothing because clothing is so broadly defined. We could only choose to buy, say, housing instead of clothing, electricity instead of clothing. Broadly defined goods, almost by definition, do not have close substitutes. Narrowly defined goods, again, almost by definition, do have close substitutes, many close substitutes. As a result, the own price elasticity for blue jeans should be quite high because there are many close substitutes to a narrowly defined good. But we shouldn't expect the same to be true for clothing. Clothing is a broadly defined good, therefore we should expect clothing to have few close substitutes and a very low price elasticity of demand. All right, next example. Compare the two goods insulin versus Caribbean cruises. Now, the Caribbean's not particularly relevant, but keep the cruises in mind. We're talking about cruise ship vacations. Insulin, in case anybody's not familiar, is a specific drug which is used by diabetics, patients with diabetes. Allows them to regulate their blood sugar levels, and patients with diabetes need a steady supply of insulin, at least for a certain type of diabetes. Now, what's different between these two goods? You could think of in the same vein as the difference between sunscreen and breakfast cereal, or between blue jeans and clothing. You could think of this as a difference in the amount or quality of available substitutes. But this isn't the only key distinction to make between these two. The other key distinction to make between these two is that cruise ship vacations aren't something that anybody really needs. They're a luxury that you can have if you can afford and you can enjoy. But if you're not able to take that cruise ship vacation, nothing will happen to your health. There's no risk that you will die, and the same is not true for insulin. Those people who need insulin do really need insulin. They may very well die if they don't receive a steady supply of insulin. As a result, those diabetic patients who need insulin may pay a very high price, if they must pay a very high price, without varying the quantity of insulin that they demand very much at all. The same wouldn't be true for cruise ship vacations. If the price of cruise vacations increased dramatically, people who don't need those cruise ship vacations could easily spend that money on something else, even something similar, such as a resort vacation at a resort on land. In general, we would say that goods which are luxuries, that is to say, goods that are not needed, those goods, all else equal, will have high price elasticities of demand. On the other hand, the goods which are necessary, where insulin is an extreme case, those goods would tend, all else equal, to have quite low elasticities of demand. As our last example, we look not at a pair of goods, but at the same good in two different scenarios. So the first scenario is gasoline in the short run. Well, the short run is maybe the next few months, the next year, versus gasoline in the long run. And by the long run, we mean 5, 10 years. And whether you would expect the own price elasticity of demand to be higher for gasoline in the short run or gasoline in the long run? Now, remember, when we talk about elasticity of demand, we're talking about responsiveness of consumers to changes in the price. What allows consumers to be relatively more responsive? Well, to be responsive to changes in the price, consumers are going to have to change the decisions that they make, the products that they consume, and the way that they live. For people to consume gasoline, this generally means driving their own automobiles. And people drive their own automobiles due to fixed patterns of behavior, due to the lifestyle decisions that they've made in many cases well in advance. So if somebody drives their car to work and uses gasoline in order to do this, they drive the car that they already have from the apartment where they already live to the job where they already work. And somehow, if the price of gasoline goes up, we expect them to make a change in those decisions, that lifestyle pattern, in order to allow them to change the amount of gasoline that they buy. And in the short run, that's not very easy to do. They have the car that they have the apartment that they have the job that they have, and the way for them to get to work is to drive the car that they have from the apartment that they have to the job that they have. As a result, their responsiveness in the short term tends to be quite low. So the own price elasticity of demand is low. But as we move forward 5 to 10 years in the future, we assume that the price of gasoline has risen and remained high, people might make changes in that lifestyle pattern that allow them to accommodate this higher gasoline price into their consumption decisions more easily. For example, they might decide to trade in that old car, which uses a lot of gasoline, for a new car which uses less. Replace an older car or a larger car with a newer and smaller car. That's something that's difficult to do in the short run, but it's easier to do in the long run. They might, in some cases, also decide to change where they work. If it's extremely expensive for them to go across the city in order to get to where they work, they might choose a new employer when they are next seeking an employer which is closer to where they live. As a summary for our fundamental determinants of the own price elasticity of demand, these 4 primary determinants of own price elasticity of demand are close substitutes, their availability, and how close they are. Next, how broadly or narrowly we define the good. Third, whether the good is a necessity or a luxury. And fourth, whether we're looking at a long time horizon or a short time horizon. Now, next, what we want to do is to talk about how demand curves can be characterized or categorized based on the elasticity of demand. We have some demand curves which represent demand, which is very responsive to changes in the price. We have other demand curves that are representative of demand, which is not very responsive to the price. In total, we have 5 different categories for demand based on changes in elasticity of demand alone. Now, the first of these is an extreme case. The first of these is what we call perfectly inelastic demand. Now, what does perfectly inelastic demand look like as we draw our demand curve? It's simply a vertical line. Now, note, our demand curves have on the vertical axis price, on the horizontal axis quantity. So if we have a demand curve that's a vertical line, this means quantity is fixed. The quantity that people demand will never change, no matter what happens to the price. The price could be 0, the price could be nearly infinite, and the quantity that people demand would be exactly the same. Now, for this vertical demand curve, quantity never changes, so the percentage change in quantity is always 0. It's on the top of our fraction for calculating elasticity. The percentage change in price could be 10%, 20%, 40%, 50%. Percentage change in quantity would be 0. As a result, the own price elasticity of demand is always 0. This is what we mean by perfectly inelastic demand. Our next category of demand curves, again based on elasticity definitions, is less of an extreme case. Well, this is simply inelastic demand. Perfectly inelastic demand means that consumers don't respond at all to changes in the price. For inelastic demand, consumers do respond, but not very much. So here we would describe demand as being inelastic so long as the percentage change in quantity was smaller than the percentage change in the price. So if the price were to increase by 10% and the quantity demanded were to decrease by 6% or 4% or 1%, any of these would be classified as inelastic demand. To all else equal, inelastic demand curves are relatively steep, as you can see in the illustration in the slide. And inelastic demand means an elasticity which is somewhere between 0 and 1. Now, 1 is not inelastic demand. 0 is perfectly inelastic rather than simply inelastic demand. Anywhere in the range in between means inelastic demand. Now, our third case, our third classification of demand curves based on elasticity is another extreme case, really just a more limiting case, not so much as in the case of perfectly inelastic demand, a case which is unlikely to be observed in the real world. The third case is what we call unit elastic demand. Unit elastic demand has an elasticity of 1. Unity. Now, an elasticity of 1 means that whatever the percentage change in the price will be, will have an identical or inverse, negative change in the quantity. Now, if we have a percentage increase in the price of 10% for unit elastic demand, we would have a decrease in the quantity demanded also of 10%. We would have an increase in the price of 50% and a decrease in quantity demanded of 50%. Now, these unit elastic demand curves would be neither steep nor flat, relatively speaking. And this would be considered a moderate case, even a typical case. To say that goods in general might, on average, come close to being unit elastic in terms of their demand. Now, the next case, our fourth classification of demand based on elasticity, is elastic demand. Elastic demand is how we categorize any demand curve with an elasticity greater than 1. That means the responsiveness is higher. The responsiveness to changes in the price such that a price change of 10% would lead to a 20% drop or a 50% drop in quantity demanded, which could give us an elasticity of demand of 2 or 5. This high degree of responsiveness to changes in the price would go along with, relatively speaking, flatter demand curves. Now, the last extreme case, this fifth category of demand, is perfectly elastic demand. As you can see in the slide, a demand curve representing perfectly elastic demand is simply a horizontal line as opposed to a vertical line. And again, for our demand curves, the horizontal axis is quantity, the vertical axis is price. So a horizontal axis can take any potential quantity, but has only one price. What that means is if the price were to rise just a little bit above that price, quantity would immediately drop to 0. And as long as the price stays at that price, quantity demanded is potentially infinite because the percentage change in price is always 0. And the percentage change in quantity could be any amount at all. So we could describe this as either having an infinite elasticity or as having an undefined elasticity. Whereas that extreme case of perfectly inelastic demand, that vertical demand curve, that's a bit difficult to imagine unless we wind up with a market where people are forced to pay for air to breathe. But in this case, we look at perfectly elastic demand. This isn't actually as odd or rare as it might seem. What we would imagine is that provided a particular good meets the characteristics we want it to for perfect competition, meaning it's identical to all the other versions of this good that are available for sale anywhere else, that particular good, say the tomatoes being sold by one seller at a big market, they're indistinguishable from every other seller's tomatoes, they should have perfectly elastic demand. That if the price that they charge were to go just a little bit above the market price, the quantity demanded would immediately fall to zero. Everyone would choose to buy someone else's tomatoes instead of their expensive tomatoes. And if they were to lower their price just a little bit below the market price, everyone would rush to buy their tomatoes until they're sold out. Next to mention, as you can see in the slide, a few representative elasticities from the real world. You can try to understand why it is that these goods might have these estimated empirical elasticities. Note, these aren't hypothetical. They're specialized economists who devoted a great deal of time and energy to calculating exactly how responsive consumers are when it comes to decisions to purchase eggs. And they find that when it comes to eggs, consumers are very unresponsive to changes in the price. The own price elasticity of demand for eggs is very low. Now, of course, eggs are one kind of food. There are many other kinds of food. Anybody who doesn't buy eggs could buy some other kind of food and they wouldn't starve. But eggs, for various recipes that those eggs fit in, don't have any close substitutes at all. There's nothing that fills the role of an egg in, for example, production of bread. Now, the next on the list, a good with very low responsiveness to changes in the price, a good with very low own price elasticity of demand, is healthcare. Healthcare is a necessity and a broadly defined good. People will continue to buy it even when it becomes expensive. Next is rice. Rice is also a fundamental foodstuff. Rice does have other substitutes, such as bulgur, such as wheat, other things that you could use instead of rice. And it's easier in recipes to substitute something else instead of rice than it is in the case of eggs. The same when we go on down the list to beef, which has an elasticity of 1.6, 3 times as high as the elasticity for rice, 1.6 times as high as the elasticity for eggs. Beef, again, is a foodstuff, a common foodstuff. Beef has close substitutes, such as chicken, other kinds of meat that you could eat instead of beef, leading for beef to have a higher elasticity of demand. Also, compared to rice, beef might be considered more of a luxury and less of a necessity, since it's less of a basic fundamental foodstuff. Moving on down the list, restaurant meals have an even higher own price elasticity of demand than beef. Restaurant meals are considered more of a luxury, less of a necessity, even though it's a broadly defined good, which as a result wouldn't have as many close substitutes. Last on that list is one specific brand of soft drink called Mountain Dew, with an estimated own price elasticity of 4.4. That estimated own price elasticity of 4.4 is quite high, specifically because Mountain Dew, in addition to being a luxury, not a necessity, not something you need to live, is a very narrowly defined good, which as a result has many, many, many close substitutes. More close substitutes than rice does, more close substitutes than beef does. Oh, to mention one more item on that list that I skipped over, housing has an estimated own price elasticity of demand of 0.7. I think of housing as being a good which is definitely a necessity, something that people definitely need to survive. However, housing is also a very large portion of many people's budgets. As a result, those goods which make up a very large portion of people's budgets have another limiting factor when it comes to the elasticity or responsiveness of demand to changes in the price, and that's how much people can afford to spend. So the fact that people's incomes, people's budgets are limited cause the elasticity of demand for housing to be higher than it might otherwise be. Closer to unity in this particular case than it might otherwise be expected to be, because people aren't able to afford as much housing, even though they may wish they could, when the price of housing rises. Next, the demand curves that we used in those illustrations of categories of demand based on supply, they were curved. They weren't straight. But the demand curves that we used in the previous chapter for demand curves, when calculating a demand curve based on a demand schedule, etc., they were straight. Of course, real demand curves should be estimated empirically based on real data. They could be curved or they could be straight. Now, it's possible for a curved demand curve to have one elasticity of demand no matter where you look at on that demand curve. Another way to say that, if you have an elasticity of 1, you wouldn't have a straight demand curve. You would have a particular curved shape to that demand curve. So if we do have a straight demand curve, as you can see in the slide, the elasticity for different points along that demand curve will change. Now, for points on the upper part of that demand curve, that's points where the quantity demanded is low and the price is relatively high. For that range of points on the demand curve, the own price elasticity of demand is relatively high. There's one point in the middle where the own price elasticity of demand on any straight line demand curve will be exactly 1. And for the lower part of the demand curve, indicating lower prices and higher quantities, that whole range on the demand curve will have elasticity which is less than 1, so inelastic demand. As we move along the demand curve, as quantity increases, elasticity begins high and gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, or begins elastic and becomes more and more and more inelastic, passing through unit elastic. Next, for business applications, one important application of elasticity is in trying to determine whether an increase in the price that we charge for a product, assuming that people will pay it, assuming we can pick any point along the demand curve, as monopolists do, which we'll get into in later chapters. If we can choose any point on that demand curve, which point on that demand curve would give us the highest possible revenue based on consumers' responsiveness to changes in the price? What price should we charge? What price would maximize the revenue that we would get? If we were to raise the price, would consumers respond so much to that change in the price that our revenues would fall? Or would consumers respond so slightly that the revenues that we raise would increase? Now here, if we increase the price that we charge by 10%, but we decrease the number that we sell by 10%, our revenues would remain approximately equal. If, on the other hand, we raise the price that we charge and the quantity that we sell decreases by twice as much as the increase in our price, our total revenues would fall. Well, that indicates elastic demand, high responsiveness to changes in the price. 20% change in price, 10% change in, and 40% change in the quantity. This would indicate total revenues for our product falling as we increase the price. In the other case, if we have inelastic demand, we might have a very small change in the quantity that people buy as we increase our price. If we have a 10% increase in our price, but only a 5% decrease in the quantity that we sell, then the total revenue that we raise would rise. Remember, total revenue we calculate in a very simple way. Total revenue is just the price that we charge per unit times the quantity per unit that we sell. Price times quantity rises when we increase the price if demand is inelastic. Total revenue, or price times quantity, falls when we raise the price if demand is elastic. And total revenue, price times quantity, should be approximately constant when we raise the price if the elasticity is unit elastic, or if demand is unit elastic. And then note, if we have a demand curve, which is a straight line, just like some of the simple demand curves that we drew in the previous chapter, it's not to say that all demand curves are straight lines. If our demand curve is a straight line, there's a range with a high elasticity, with elastic demand. There's a range with inelastic demand. And there's a single point that has unit elasticity. Now, if we charge any price for our good, which is in that range of inelastic demand, we would see that our total revenue could rise if we were to increase the price that we charge, even though the quantity that consumers buy would fall. So it would be in our best interests, potentially, as a business, if we can pick and choose any point on that demand curve, that's any combination of price and quantity, to continue to increase the price until we reach that point where demand is unit elastic. Suppose, on the other hand, we start at a price where the price is quite high. We would see that as we lower the price, in that range of a straight line demand curve, demand is elastic, and as we lower the price, we increase the quantity that people demand by so much that our total revenues rise. So as we decrease and decrease and decrease the price, our total revenues rise and rise and rise until we reach that point where demand is unit elastic. Once we reach that point, we can no longer increase total revenues by lowering the price, and we can no longer increase total revenues by raising the price. So that point where demand is unit elastic on that straight line demand curve, that is the revenue maximizing combination of quantity and price. Now, that isn't to say that a business, a monopoly perhaps, that has the ability to choose any point on the demand curve is necessarily going to want to choose the point that maximizes total revenue, but it might be one consideration that they could take into account. Next, we want to look at two potential applications of elasticity in a policy rather than a business context. Now look at here one specific policy, which is drug interdiction. What drug interdiction refers to, interdiction is not a specialized economics term, nor a term that I would really expect you to know. What we're referring to is the job of the police and law enforcement in finding and arresting people selling and trafficking illegal drugs, heroin, cocaine, all of these things. Now, when police and law enforcement try to catch those people who are selling and distributing illegal drugs, they try to decrease the supply of available illegal drugs. And by doing so, they drive up the price of illegal drugs, such as heroin, cocaine, things like that. Now, we would contrast this with another potential policy, which we'll get to next, which would be methods instead of reducing the supply of illegal drugs, but to reduce the demand for illegal drugs. Now, note first that one side effect that we have of the use of illegal drugs, such as heroin and cocaine, is that those individuals who use heroin and cocaine, who are addicted to heroin and cocaine, need to get access to that drug because they're highly addictive. And as a result, there's a lot of property crime associated with addiction to drugs like heroin. That is, automobiles that are stolen, people on the street who are mugged, houses who are broken into. And this drug-related crime is one of the most important problems that is associated with drug use in general. What we want to look at specifically is which of these policies is likely to reduce rather than increase drug-related crime. Now, what we assume is that there's a linear relationship between the total amount of money that's spent on illegal drugs and drug-related crime. Assume that heroin addicts don't have a lot of money of their own, and if they're going to get money to spend to buy heroin, they're going to need to steal things to do this. Now, this is an assumption, but this is a fundamental basis of this policy scenario. We'll look at one policy that decreases the supply of heroin, and another policy that decreases the demand for heroin. First, note in the case of interdiction, we're shifting the supply of heroin, and the demand curve that we use is very steep. Now that steep demand curve goes along with a demand which is inelastic. Why inelastic? Well, for the same reason that demand for cigarettes tends to be inelastic, because heroin is highly addictive. As a result, people who use it tend to need to continue using it no matter how expensive it becomes. And they're not very responsive to changes in the price at all. People who don't use heroin aren't likely to choose to start using heroin just because it becomes cheap. We see what happens as we shift the supply curve inward from S1 to S2. This is a reduction here in supply, as law enforcement have found and arrested many people who are dealing, selling, marketing, producing heroin. So there's less heroin on the market. The quantity of heroin which is consumed, bought, and sold does decrease in this scenario from Q1 to Q2 as we move from this equilibrium point in the market, point 1 to point 2. However, as a result of our drug interdiction policy, by arresting so many drug dealers, we've caused the price of heroin to increase substantially. Because our demand curve is inelastic, the change in equilibrium price is large, but the change in equilibrium quantity is small. Any inelastic demand curve would give us the same result with any shift in supply. And the result is that that rectangle indicating total revenue spent on heroin is actually larger after the drug interdiction policy is put in place than it was before. That means more money is being spent on heroin than was being spent before, even though less heroin is available on the market and less heroin is being consumed. As a result, with more money being spent, addicts need more money in order to buy heroin, and they may be stealing more cars, stealing more purses, breaking into more houses in order to get this money. We might expect drug-related crime to actually increase because of law enforcement's success in arresting drug dealers and driving up the price of heroin. Now, the second alternative policy we might analyze would be as an alternative to devoting more resources to arresting drug dealers, drug producers, to take heroin off the market. Suppose government invests the same resources in trying to educate people in order to get them off heroin, that is, educating people who already use it, or to convince people who might consider trying it not to, by making them ever more aware of the various health problems that arise from long-term heroin use, risks of overdose, etc. Now, the goal of a successful drug education policy is to decrease the demand for heroin. If we decrease the demand for heroin, we would shift along that existing supply curve, and we would reduce both the quantity and the price of heroin at equilibrium. Because when these drug dealers, these drug sellers, they see that there's fewer people who want to buy heroin, they compete with one another, lower the price. So those people who continue to use heroin in this scenario pay a lower price for heroin than they did in the baseline, and especially in the drug interdiction scenario. So as a result, less money overall with the education policy, provided it's successful, is spent on heroin. And with less money being spent, there's less need to steal in order to raise money to buy heroin. We expect drug-related crime to decrease. So next what we want to talk about is a few other elasticities. Now, maybe the most important elasticity, and certainly the most common elasticity that we talk about. What we mean usually when we simply say elasticity is this own price elasticity of demand. But we could also talk about the own price elasticity of supply. This is analogous, calculated in very much the same way. This is the percentage change in quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in the price. And crudely, this is intended to measure how responsive firms are to changes in the price, rather than how responsive consumers are to changes in the price. So businesses' price sensitivity. For own price elasticity of supply, again, because we want our measure to be consistent, use that midpoint method to calculate the percentage change in price. Use the midpoint method to calculate the percentage change in quantity supplied. Divide the latter by the former. As you can see in this example, as we move from point 1 to point 2, we increase both price and quantity, moving from P1Q1 to P2Q2. We have a 16% increase in quantity with an 8% increase in price, giving us an own price elasticity of supply of 2. Well, in this case, that 2 is a positive number, and given what we've already described as this law of supply, and as close as it comes in economics to a natural law, something we expect to always hold true, supply should always have a positive elasticity, just like demand always has a negative one. No need to mention that it's positive, but in this case, it is. And it won't vary from positive to negative based on circumstance. Just as in the case of demand, we could describe or categorize supply curves using the same basic set of characteristics, set of supply elasticities. We can have a supply curve which is perfectly inelastic. Just like with demand, a supply curve which is perfectly inelastic has an elasticity of 0, so it's a vertical line. We have exactly the same quantity supplied no matter what the price is. This is what we'd be likely to see in the real world, even though this is somewhat of an extreme case. This is what we would be likely to see in the real world, provided the quantity of this good available is genuinely fixed. And there's absolutely nothing that can be done to increase or even decrease the amount of it which is available for sale. We might think of a good which has perfectly inelastic supply as, for example, seats in a stadium. Nothing that can be done, at least in the near term, can be done to increase the number of seats that exist. It's fixed. And any price could potentially be charged for those tickets without enabling the company to produce a larger number of seats, or without incentivizing them to put fewer seats available for sale. Next category of supply curves, classifications again based on elasticity, would be inelastic supply. Analogous to the categorization for demand, inelastic supply means a relatively steep supply curve where the percentage change in quantity is small relative to the percentage change in the price. So the elasticity of supply is less than 1, between 0 and 1. If we have a 2% change in the quantity supplied and a 10% change in the price, this would give us an elasticity of 0.2 and inelastic supply. Next category, unit elastic supply, in between elastic and inelastic supply, means an elasticity of supply of 1 and the same percentage change in quantity supplied as the percentage change in the price. That fourth case, elastic supply, means a relatively flat supply curve. The responsiveness of firms is relatively high to changes in the price, and the percentage change in quantity is large relative to the percentage change in the price. That elastic supply might go along with an elasticity of supply of 3 or 5 or 10. Anything greater than 1, but less than infinity. Because if we have infinity, this is the fifth case, the other extreme case. We would have an elasticity of supply of infinity if our supply curve is horizontal. If our supply curve is horizontal, for some given price, businesses would potentially be willing to produce any quantity of output, any quantity supplied. And if the price were to fall just a little bit below that, no businesses would be willing to supply anything. While this is also extreme, this, as with demand, is not implausible. In the case of supply, we might expect, in a perfectly competitive industry, in the very long run, output in the whole industry to have perfectly elastic supply. Is if we could open up one more restaurant, and that additional restaurant would have exactly the same cost as every other restaurant that already existed, and wouldn't influence the costs for those restaurants that already exist in any way, then no matter what happens to demand for restaurant meals, we could potentially see any amount of increase in the long run, the number of restaurants available, without seeing any change in the price that those businesses would need to charge. On the other hand, if all of those restaurants that we have in a market are just barely breaking even and none are exceptionally profitable, we might see if the price for restaurant meals were to fall below a certain threshold, if that threshold is what's indicated by the price on our perfectly elastic supply curve, all of those restaurants could simultaneously close. As in the case of the elasticity of demand, we would also like to characterize the elasticity of supply based on a few important determinants. That is to say, as in the case of demand, what is it that allows these businesses to be more responsive to changes in the price? Some of those carry over directly from the determinants of the own price elasticity of demand. For example, in the long run, businesses are able to be more responsive to changes in the price than businesses would be in the short run. As a result, in the long run, the own price elasticity of supply would be high, but in the short run, the own price elasticity of demand would be low. Another important determinant of the elasticity of supply is the availability of fundamentally scarce inputs or resources that are needed for the production of that particular good. If production of a particular good needs some kind of a fundamentally scarce resource, as gasoline, for example, requires crude oil, or all-inclusive resorts require beachfront land, or require sand to build a beach on oceanfront land. Those require fundamentally scarce resources, and as we try to increase the quantity of those goods that we produce, we might drive the price of those goods, the cost of producing those goods, up, and as a result have a lower own price elasticity of supply. Next, for many realistic or plausible supply curves, we would expect a certain range of values on the supply curve indicating relatively smaller quantities and relatively lower prices to have more elastic supply. However, as the quantity that's produced rises, we would expect those supply curves, right, to become steeper and to become less elastic, more and more inelastic. And this would result not simply from calculation of elasticity along a straight line curve, but because of something fundamental to the way these goods are produced, that as this single business, or as all the businesses in this market, increase their production past a certain threshold, they begin to see supply constraints kick in. due to the lack of availability of certain scarce resources. This can be a scarce resource like beachfront property, which exists in a fundamentally limited quantity, or it can be something such as, say, computer engineers that a business might require, where training is required for a type of skilled labor that doesn't have quite the right skills for the job at hand. Next, we have a few other elasticities of demand to mention, though we won't spend as much time on them as the own price elasticity of demand or the own price elasticity of supply. These are the responsiveness of the quantity demanded to other determinants of demand, not the price, or at least not the price of the good in question. The first to mention, the income elasticity of demand. The income elasticity of demand is the percentage change in the quantity divided by the percentage change in the person's income. Now, this income elasticity of demand could be for an individual person, based on that person's quantity demanded for a good, or it could be calculated at the market level, where we're looking at an average increase in income for all of the market participants. And if we're looking at a market level income elasticity of demand, then this would characterize a product. We could talk about the income elasticity of demand for apples, or the income elasticity of demand for housing. Now, whereas the own price elasticity of demand is always negative, so we ignore that fact. The own price elasticity of supply is always positive, so we ignore that fact. The income elasticity of demand can be positive or negative, in addition to being large or being small. So we don't just describe the income elasticity as being high or low, or the income elasticity as being elastic or inelastic, but critically as positive or negative. Now, some goods might have an income elasticity of 1. We would say this is an average or a typical income elasticity for a normal good. Normal goods would be a category of good where as we see a price increase, as we see the income increase, we would see the quantity demanded for that good increase as well. And a 10% increase in income would allow a person to spend 10% more on all of the goods that they buy. So if the price does not change for these goods across the board, they should on average be able to purchase 10% more. So a typical income elasticity would be 1. Some goods will have a higher income elasticity. These would be the goods we would choose to buy many more of. We are more responsive in our consumption decisions to changes in income. Those goods we would be likely to categorize as luxuries, goods which are purchased in larger quantities by people with higher incomes. Necessities, we might be less responsive to purchases and changes of income. We might, if our income were to increase by 20%, not increase our spending on bread by 20%, even if we do increase our spending on bread. And then there's another category of goods which we would classify neither as luxuries nor as necessities per se, but as inferior goods relative to normal goods. Those inferior goods, as we mentioned in the previous lecture, those are goods where an increase in price, an increase in income, actually leads to a decrease in the quantity of those goods that we choose to buy. Those goods are inferior. It's a specific type of a good, which is of very low quality. It's not bread in general. It's low quality, cheap bread. It's not noodles in general. It's low quality, cheap noodles. And as our income increases and we're able to afford better versions of the same good, we would choose to buy less cheap noodles and more of the relatively more expensive noodles, less cheap bread and more of the relatively expensive bread. So those type of goods would have a negative income elasticity of demand. So we would have a positive change in income with a negative change, percentage change in quantity demanded. Now a good may be inferior with a relatively low responsiveness to a change in income, or it could be inferior with a relatively large responsiveness to changes in income. But provided the income elasticity of demand is negative, we would classify it as being inferior. The next elasticity it's worth mentioning is what we would call a cross-price elasticity of demand. A cross-price elasticity of demand is also the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in a price. But here, in contrast with the own price elasticity of demand, it's not the price of the good whose quantity we are measuring. It's the price of some other good. So we might be looking at the responsiveness of the quantity demanded for bread, not to the change in price of bread, but to the change in price of tea, or the change in price of honey, or to the change in price of meat. Since it's a different price, it's not the own price, it's a cross-price elasticity. Now, as we said, for the income elasticity of demand, a typical elasticity value is 1. As for the own price elasticity of demand, a typical elasticity is 1. For the cross-price elasticity of demand, a typical elasticity is 0. As to say that most goods are not very closely related at all. And we wouldn't expect, naturally, for a change in the price of automobiles to lead to much of any change in the quantity demanded for bread, or much of any change in the quantity demanded for honey, or much of any change in the quantity demanded for athletic shoes. The only time when we would expect the cross-price elasticity of demand to be non-zero is if we're looking at a specific pair of goods which have some kind of a consumption relationship. Either on the one hand, these two goods are substitutes, where we never consume both, we only consume one, or these two goods are complements, where we consume both, but rarely one at a time. If these two goods are substitutes, then the change in the quantity of one good will respond to a change in the price of the other good, very much as though it was a change in the price of the good itself. As a result, we would see a negative cross-price elasticity of demand. As the price of one goes up, the demand for the other falls. Quantity demanded for the other falls. What kind of goods might have this relationship? Any goods we prefer to consume together. For example, if we prefer to consume milk together with coffee, these two goods might have that kind of a relationship. If we prefer to consume basketball shorts with basketball shoes, these two goods might have that kind of a relationship, where the quantity demanded for basketball shorts would drop as the price of basketball shoes increased, because people treat these as a bundle of a single good rather than being distinct and separate goods. So the own price elasticity and the cross-price elasticity would have the same sign, both negative if these goods are complements. On the other hand, if these goods are substitutes, we would expect to see an increase in the price of one cause a decrease in the quantity demanded for that good, but an increase in the demand for the substitute. For our classic case for substitutes, two different kinds of meat, as we increase the price of beef, we cause a decrease in the quantity demanded for beef, so we have a negative own price elasticity for beef. But as we increase that price for beef, we see an increase in the quantity demanded for chicken. So we expect to see a positive cross-price elasticity between chicken and beef, because these two goods are substitutes rather than complements, two goods that we don't want to consume together. We would consume one, but never both. In this lecture, we've described the 4 key elasticities, own price elasticity of demand, own price elasticity of supply, income elasticity, cross price elasticity, and how they can be applied both in a business scenario or policy scenario. In the next lecture, we'll look at a couple more key policies and how the model of supply and demand can be used to analyze their effects. Those are rent control policies, and also minimum wage laws and payroll taxes.